When I was a kid, my mom loved putting together photo albums. They were these heavy, beautiful books that told our family's story. But a few months ago, while I was cleaning out my childhood home, I found one I'd never seen before, page after page. There were smiling faces, my parents, my sister, all of them happy and together. But in every single family shot, there was a meticulous, jagged cut. The scissors had done their work with quiet precision, and I realized I had been erased from my own family's history. This is a story about the day I decided I was done letting my family define me. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ava, and for as long as I can remember, I have built things. I built Lego castles as a child, meticulously following the instructions. And I built tree houses in the backyard, drawing up blueprints on scrap paper. Now, at 35, I am an architect in Boston, a career I chose because I crave order, structure, and the clear, unbending rules of design. My life, my work, and my relationship with Noah, a kind and intuitive photographer who sees the world in light and shadow, felt like the perfect blueprint. A solid foundation, a strong frame, a design I was proud to call my own. The one variable, the one element that never fit into my design, was my family. I am the oldest of two girls, and I've always been the strong one, the responsible one. My sister, Willow, is the delicate one, the one with the sensitive soul who needs to be handled with care. The unwritten law of our family was simple. My needs were always secondary to hers. My mother, Carol, was the unappointed enforcer of this law, her voice a soft, placating hum that always made me feel guilty for wanting what was mine. "You've always been the strong one, Ava," she'd say. It was a phrase she used to ask me to give something up, to lend a helping hand, to step aside for my sister. The words were a quiet, insistent chisel, slowly chipping away at my sense of self. Just a few months ago, while Noah and I were sorting through some of my old things at my parents' house, I found a worn leather photo album, the kind my grandmother used to keep, tucked away in a dusty box in the basement. It felt like a relic from a different time. I opened it, my fingers tracing the delicate patterns on the cover. Inside, I expected to see the story of my childhood. Instead, I found a book of ghosts, on page after page of familiar family photos, holidays, birthdays, vacations. My image had been surgically, precisely cut out. My parents' smiling faces remained. Willow's beaming expression was untouched, but where I should have been, there was only a clean, jagged edge, a negative space where I once stood. I ran my fingers over the empty space, feeling the absence of my own face. My hands started to tremble, a tremor that traveled up my arms and into my chest. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a conscious, quiet act of being cut from my own family's history. I closed the album slowly, the weight of a lifetime of being overlooked suddenly settling on my shoulders. I put the album back in the box and didn't say a word. I felt as if I were holding a ghost. The after-party dress had been my one small indulgence, my single-handed rebellion against the life of accommodation I had always led. It wasn't just a dress. It was a piece of art, a custom-designed silk column from a small French atelier I discovered on a business trip. It was the only thing I hadn't let my mother have a say in, after months of searching. It was everything I had ever wanted. The silk felt like liquid on my skin, and the color was a soft, incandescent ivory that seemed to capture the light. I had just gotten back from a final meeting with our caterer, mentally running through the last-minute details. When I walked into the living room and froze, Willow was standing in front of the full-length mirror, her slender frame draped in the ivory silk. She was twisting back and forth, admiring her reflection, completely oblivious to my presence. My mother, Carol, stood beside her, a measuring tape in her hand. My heart stuttered, the way it does when you step on a broken floorboard you didn't see. The silk, which had felt so perfect on my own skin, now seemed to cling to Willow like a second skin. "It fits," my mother said, her voice a low purr of satisfaction. "I told you it would. It looks so much better on you anyway." Her words hit me with the quiet finality of a gavel. She hadn't asked, they hadn't told me, they had simply taken, confident that I would, as always, accommodate Willow, still admiring herself, finally caught my reflection in the mirror. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. "Mom thinks we should both wear white at the wedding," she said, her voice innocent, her eyes anything but, you know, like a twin bride thing. My mother nodded. A placating smile stretched across her face. "Darling, it's a new trend, very European. After all, a marriage is a celebration of family, and your sister deserves to shine too." The phrase hung in the air, a physical weight. She deserves to shine too. A familiar, venomous little phrase that meant my own light was always secondary. My life, my day, my dress, all of it was just another stage for Willow to perform on. I felt the tectonic plates inside me, the ones I had spent a lifetime holding together, finally begin to shift. This wasn't about a dress. This was about my entire life. The familiar knot of tension in my stomach was gone. In its place, a cold, clear resolve. The next day, I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. I started by transferring every single dime from my shared savings account with my parents into a new, separate account that only I could access. The confirmation email arrived with a quiet, final click. I then hired a private event planner from an agency completely unrelated to my mother's social circle. Her name was Tasha. And when I told her my story, she listened without judgment. "We can build a fortress around your day," she said, her voice firm and calm. I gave her full authority to communicate with all vendors. With a single, unbending rule, all changes must be authorized by me and me alone. The next call was to our venue, followed by our caterer, the florist, and the photographer. With each call, I calmly stated that any past arrangements made without my consent were now void. The calls were met with varying degrees of surprise, but I stood my ground, my voice steady, my purpose clear. The final call was to a security firm specializing in high-profile events. "I need a team to manage the guest list and ensure no one unauthorized gets past the entryway," I explained, my voice as neutral as possible. "We're prepared for a potential family dispute." The silence on the other end of the line was short. "Consider it done," he said. But my most profound act was not a phone call. It was a quiet, digital rebellion. I had a small blog, mostly a hobby, where I wrote about architecture and design. That evening, I sat at my laptop and wrote a piece titled, "Building Strong Boundaries: The Importance of Protecting Your Design in It." I used the language of my profession to describe my personal situation, the need for a solid foundation, the importance of clear lines, and the danger of letting others take over your blueprint. The post went viral, a quiet, knowing cry that resonated with people who had spent their lives being built over. 2 days later, I invited my family to dinner at a restaurant, a neutral ground I chose myself. I watched as they laughed and chattered, blissfully unaware of the new reality I had set in motion. After the main course, I stood and handed my mother a sealed envelope. Just a little something for you, I said, my voice betraying nothing inside. There was no money, just a short, typewritten note that read, "Thank you for showing me what I needed to do. Everything is now paid for." My mother's smile disappeared as her fingers fumbled with the paper. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. The silence that filled the room was not a peaceful one. It was the quiet before a storm. The day arrived, a crisp, cool October day in Boston, the kind of day that feels like a fresh start, 3 hours before the ceremony. My phone buzzed with a text from Noah's best man, our head of security for the day. They're here, and they're in white. I took a deep breath. My mother, father, and Willow were standing outside the venue, their clothes almost identical to my wedding dress. I had spent so long imagining this moment, the moment I would finally walk down the aisle. But a new image came to mind, my grandmother's words, a quiet promise she had made to me months ago. "You are the one who gets to decide," at the chapel. My father stepped forward, his arm outstretched. I looked at him, then at my mother, her face a mask of determined innocence, and finally at Willow, her dress a cheap imitation of my own. I gently shook my head. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken words. Then I turned to the one person who had always stood in my corner, my grandmother. I took her arm and walked into the church, leaving my father and the others standing in the doorway. The wedding went on as planned, a beautiful, seamless ceremony that felt entirely mine. At the reception, as I made my way to the microphone for the toast, a quiet stillness fell over the room. I raised my glass, my eyes scanning the room, my gaze falling on each person who had supported Noah and me. My grandmother, Noah's parents, our friends, my colleagues. I smiled. "I want to thank everyone who has come here today. You have shown us what true support and love really look like. This isn't just a wedding. It is a celebration of our lives, built on a foundation of respect, not obligation, to a future of clear lines and strong foundations." I held the glass high, my eyes not once looking at the family table, leaving an empty, silent space that spoke louder than any words. The cameras flashed, immortalizing not only our joy, but also their quiet, public humiliation. 6 months later, Noah and I bought a brownstone in a quiet suburb of Providence, Rhode Island. The distance, 3 states and 100 miles, felt like a deep, cleansing breath. The city lights were no longer my masterpiece. This quiet, peaceful life was. We weren't completely estranged from my family, but contact was now on my terms. Phone calls were scheduled, visits were planned. There were no more impromptu drop-ins, no more casual theft of my things. My mother still called, but the conversations had changed. The silences were no longer filled with her expectations. They were filled with the understanding that if she crossed a line, I would simply end the call. The silence had become my most powerful weapon. One quiet afternoon, a small, unassuming package arrived. The return address was unfamiliar, but the cursive on the label was my mother's. Inside, nestled among layers of tissue paper, was my childhood photo album, the one with all the carefully clipped photos. I held it, a ghost of a memory, and for a second, I felt the familiar emptiness. But then I looked again. There was no clean, surgical cut. The photo was a bit faded, but in it, my parents, Willow, and I were all there. The picture had been taped back together, imperfectly, with clear packing tape, a crooked line where the knife had once been. A small handwritten note fell out. "I am so sorry. Ava, I'm starting to realize that you were right. Some things need boundaries." It wasn't an apology. not really. But it was an acknowledgement, a sign that, for the first time in my life, I was being seen not for what I could give, but for who I was. I placed the album on a bookshelf in our living room, a visible but not central part of my life, a finished chapter, a lesson learned, but not something I needed to revisit. The phone rang. It was my mother. I glanced at it, then a Noah. "I'll call back later," I said, her name still on the screen. "I'm busy. I have something to do." And for the first time, I meant it. My life, my day, my peace, they were finally, truly my own. The late afternoon sun in our Providence home had a different quality than the light in Boston. It was softer, more gentle, filtering through the bay window and painting the hardwood floors in long, golden streaks. I sat on our couch, a cup of coffee growing cool in my hands, and watched the dust motes dance in the light, in this quiet, new life, without the constant noise and unspoken demands. Memories of my family would sometimes drift in like ghosts, not always bad ones. I remembered baking my mother's famous apple pie every Thanksgiving, the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and her laughter as we dusted flour on each other's noses. I remembered her holding my hand in the car on the way to my first day of college, her thumb tracing circles on my palm, just like Noah does now. It was in those moments, in the quiet solitude of our new life, that the thought would creep in maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I should have just been the bigger person, the one who tried to fix it. The part of me that had spent a lifetime seeking their approval still ached for a chance to go back and try again, to find the version of our family that existed only in those fleeting, gentle memories. But then, a sharper memory would cut through the warmth like a shard of glass. I was 10 years old, a ribbon for my art fair project in my hand, so proud of my work. My mother took the ribbon and said, "That's wonderful, honey, but Willow has always had a knack for art, too. You should let her wear it to school tomorrow to give her a little confidence boost." It was always like that, a compliment, followed by a request to give a piece of myself away. A moment of connection immediately overshadowed by her need to give Willow something of mine. The apple pies and the hand-holding were real, but they were never unconditional. They were always a transaction, a down payment on my next concession. My hand tightened around the coffee cup, the ceramic cool against my skin. Here, there were no transactions, no invisible contracts. Noah's love wasn't a reward for giving something up. It was a gift simply for being me. I didn't have to be the strong one anymore. In this life, I could be soft, or vulnerable, or angry, and the world wouldn't end. The knot in my chest, the one that had loosened on my wedding day, unraveled completely. I had spent so long trying to fix something that was never meant to be fixed. The only thing I could build was a new life, a life where I didn't have to carry the weight of their past. I put the coffee cup down and walked to the window, my breath fogging the cool glass. The letter from my mother was still on the bookshelf, and the photo album was still imperfectly taped together. They were proof that I had once been erased, and then, slowly, acknowledged. But I no longer needed their acknowledgement to exist. I was here, breathing in the fresh air of a new beginning, in a home I built with my own hands, with a man who loves me for who I am. The past was a memory, not a map, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was not going back.